Hello, Geo students. We're going to start Unit 3 with a screen recording about development. This is the first of two sets of notes on development. In this series of notes, we're going to discover why does development vary among countries and where are MDCs and LDCs distributed. To start, let's define development as the quality of life in a country based on its wealth, its education, health factors, and technology resources. When we break countries down in terms of development, we classify them as either more developed countries, MDCs, newly industrialized countries, NICs, or less developed countries, LDCs. So there is a continuum that they are on, ranging from LDC all the way up to MDC. Also, what's important to consider with development is the economic system that a country uses to structure how they're going to distribute their resources. The three main types to be familiar with are capitalism, communism, and socialism. And on the slide, you can see the characteristics of the three. When you have me for economics class in a couple of years, I actually eliminate communism from the spectrum, and we talk about just capitalism or socialism, because in reality, communism is an extreme form of socialism with absolute government control. The reason we present those to you is because in the past, instead of using MDC, LDC, and NIC, people used the terms first world, second world, and third world to refer to how developed countries were. After World War II, North American countries and Western European countries were the most developed, and so they were referred to as first world. The Soviet Union, or Russia plus its other satellite states, was referred to as the second world, the communist countries. And then the third world countries were those that were still developing in the early stages of their development. In order to measure development, we can look to the United Nations, as they've created a statistic known as the Human Development Index. It's comprised of the gross domestic product, literacy rates, other educational factors, and life expectancy of countries. Those numbers are thrown into a formula and recalculated to produce a number between 0 to 1. Countries with numbers closest to 1 are the most developed. Countries closest to 0, the least developed. So currently, Norway is the most developed country in the world with a rating of 0.97, pretty close to 1. Niger is the lowest at 0.34. When you look at Human Development Index across the globe, there are some regions that probably stand out as being the most developed: North America, Western Europe, Oceania, and there is some development occurring. You can see in Latin America, these are your NICs. Asia has quite a bit of newly industrialized countries or emerging countries. And on the fringes of Africa, you see emerging countries. The least developed countries in the world are found in sub-Saharan Africa and Central Asia. And what we'll find is currently there are developed countries that are investing in those less developed countries and starting to push them forwards towards being an NIC. This is the 2019 list of Human Development Index rankings, so you can see the top 19. I think actually on your slides you might be able to creep in and see that 20th country. But the United States ranks 15th in the world, which maybe doesn't sound great. However, when you look at the number 9.2 and compare it to 9.5, Norway's number has gone down a little bit since that last slide. The last slide was a statistic taken from 2015. The numbers are very close. Also, we have to consider economic indicators of development when we're talking about how developed a country is. So the GDP that we mentioned previously is a measure of all the values and goods and services produced in a country in a given year. And also it's important to take that big number, which is sometimes as big as $1 trillion, and divide it by the number of people in the country. Because countries with larger populations are obviously going to be able to produce a higher value of goods and services. Another thing we want to talk about is the types of jobs that people do in a country. Jobs can be broken down into three sectors. They could be primary sector jobs, where there's farming, fishing, mining, work that's done directly with the earth and doesn't require a high level of skill. Secondary sector jobs, where you take the commodities or the items that come from the primary sector and you put them together, process it, and create something from it. So it requires a higher level of skill. Or you could have a tertiary sector job, which is a service industry job. Generally, these jobs require a higher level of education and a higher level of development to have. So we'll come back to that. Lastly, we can look at the amount of technology available in a country, or the consumer goods that are there. Phones, cars, TVs are examples of these consumer goods. When you look at GDP per capita around the world, you see North America, Western Europe, Japan, Oceania, and a few countries scattered throughout the globe that produce the greatest amounts of goods and services per year. In economic theory, what a person produces is the equivalent of what they're going to bring home in terms of income. So you can see these are where each individual tends to produce more, therefore they get more back in terms of wealth. So these are considered the wealthiest countries. When we talk about primary, tertiary, or secondary jobs, the percentage that are in each country can tell you whether it's an NIC, LDC, or MDC. A country like Nepal, where 81% of the people are working primary jobs, whether it's mining or farming, compared to only 16% in tertiary jobs, is going to show that it's an LDC. On the other hand, in the United States, 3 out of every 4 jobs are tertiary jobs, only 2% are primary jobs. That indicates there's quite a bit of technology and development in the US, therefore it's an MDC. A country like Brazil has a distribution of both, kind of in the middle, so it is an NIC, and over time we'd expect to see more and more tertiary jobs in Brazil. This is a graphic showing the gap in types of jobs between MDCs and LDCs. So there's a big gap between tertiary. There's still a wide gap between secondary and primary. And notice the LDCs tend to have more primary and secondary jobs. Now, going back to the demographic transition model from last unit, we can take what we're learning about LDCs, NICs, and MDCs and look at the population of a country and also make a determination of where they fit in terms of development. Countries that are LDCs tend to be leaving stage 2 and entering stage 3 of population growth. NICs tend to be firmly planted in stage 3, moving towards stage 4, and MDCs are in stage 4 of the DTM. This is a choropleth showing access to technology around the globe. Countries that are in these top 2 tiers are going to be the ones that have the greatest access to phones. So you're looking primarily at countries that are NICs or MDCs. Other indicators of development would be social indicators. In education and literacy, we'd look at things like the literacy rate or the student-to-teacher ratio. In health and welfare, we'd look at calorie consumption. In other words, the amount of calories a person consumes in a day. We can also look at healthcare and access to hospitals, doctors, and nurses per person. The student-teacher ratio, when you have more teachers per student, that indicates an emphasis on education and a higher level of development, and you'll find that in NICs and MDCs. Caloric intake is showing the accessibility to food and the ability to create food. Instead of pointing out the MDCs, I will point out the LDCs in this case. So food is an important component to a country's development, and so these parts of the world are going to be lagging behind in development. Access to doctors is prevalent in Europe. And the interesting thing about this choropleth and the fact that Russia is in that highest tier is that the majority of people live in the European portion of Russia. So despite the fact that it's shaded all the way to the Pacific, most of the doctors are going to be located in the western part of Russia, where the people are. Another measure of development is gender equality. So the United Nations has a measure that builds on the HDI called the GDI, and they take the statistics that they use for HDI and they break them down by male and female. And so they get a score between 0 to 1 based on how close the numbers are between males and females. If there's a large gap, it indicates there is inequality. Another measure is the gender empowerment measure, which takes a look at the number of government jobs that males and females hold, and if there's a large gap between the two, that means there's inequality. When you look at GDI, countries in the world that have the highest numbers, again, falling in the category of either MDC or LDC, where they are lacking, Sub-Saharan Africa, a bit in Southwest Asia and South Asia. These are your early stages of NIC or LDC countries. When you compare the income that a female makes to that of a male doing relatively similar jobs, Western Europe, Scandinavia in particular, stands out. Southeast Asia, Oceania. Interestingly, East Africa, which has a lower level of development, does have a fair amount of gender equality when it comes to paying males and females fairly. If that was the only indicator we used to measure development, we would consider countries differently. But that's why we use several different factors when we start analyzing countries' levels of development. In regard to health, we can look at how much longer do females live than males. Sometimes there's an extra story to be told there. Perhaps the men serve more in the military and that country is actively at war. You might have men dying earlier than normal. Also, the dietary choices of males versus females in countries can also tell a story. But the largest gap seems to be in the countries that do have good access to food, and in the MDCs. And so that overabundance of food can create this gap between males and females. In regard to politics, the number of government seats held by men versus women, we find more equality in Europe, the southern part of Africa, and Latin America, Oceania. But interestingly, the United States is lagging behind in this category. If we used only politics as a measure of gender equality, the U.S. wouldn't score well. So that means there is room for the U.S. to improve. This map shows the improvement of gender inequality over the last few decades. Countries that had a large gap at the start are going to have higher numbers because there's larger space to close down. So we would expect to find that in NICs and LDCs. Other indicators of development that we might use to judge how developed a country is: how long does a person live? How many children live past the age of 1? That's infant mortality. We could look at the natural increase rate and birth rates. We could go to a population pyramid and look at the dependency ratio, or the number of retired and people under the working age of 16 compared to the workers. Or we could look at gender balance. As you've watched the slides and seen me circle things on the map, I referred to MDCs quite a bit as being in North America, Europe, Russia, Japan, and Oceania. And you can see some reasons why. Newly industrialized countries found Latin America, East Asia, and Southwest Asia. Again, reasons are listed there, and I have a few images to go along with that. In Latin America, there still is that income gap, and once that continues to get resolved as they move forward towards development, you won't see such extremes like the extreme wealth on the right of this image versus the lack of wealth on the left. You see countries in emerging economic countries engaging in the global trade, and you see larger consumers. So companies like Best Buy have opened up in China because there's a large consumer base there. Money has been flooding into Southwest Asia because of access to oil reserves there. So countries that are very wealthy, like the United Arab Emirates, are building things like Palm Island or indoor skiing facilities. LDCs are going to be found in Southeast Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and you can see reasons listed along with them. In Zambia, as they're mining for copper, you can see a lack of technology. Now that is changing because countries like China are investing in sub-Saharan African nations and bringing their technology in. China will take some of the copper from Zambia and use it to build its structures for its growing population, but it also gives Zambians structure, like it gives them the machinery. It builds large facilities for them. In fact, in a video that we normally show, they build a soccer stadium in Zambia for the people. In general, if you want to see where MDCs are located, if you were to look north of this black line, these are where more developed countries are located, and also add Oceania, south of the equator. The LDCs, or NICs, are south of that line, in general. The last two slides are introducing two models of development to be familiar with. The first is Rostow's ladder of development, and it states that countries go through 5 stages of development. When they're least developed, they have a traditional society and low-income primary sector jobs. Then there are conditions for takeoff as they move to the next phase, where investments are made in technology like we see in Zambia. After that, there's a takeoff period that countries go through, and there's rapid growth in their industries that they establish there. So a lot of sub-Saharan African nations I would expect to be in this takeoff stage over the next half century. After that, there's a drive to maturity where there's increased income, promoting growth in other sectors, and workers become more and more skilled. We're seeing that happen in Latin America in the NICs and along the edges of Asia, South Asia, some countries in Southeast Asia and East Asia. Lastly, when countries get to that MDC status, they enter an age of mass consumption, where they are manufacturing and consuming goods at a high level and producing high-tech products. The final model is the core periphery model, and it simply explains the relationship between MDCs, NICs, and LDCs. Think of the core countries as the MDCs. They produce high-profit consumption goods, and they sell them to semi-periphery and periphery countries, or NICs and MDCs. In the periphery countries, those are the LDCs, and they provide cheap labor and a lot of the raw materials that core countries will use to create those high-priced items. In the middle, you have the NICs, where countries are coming out of that periphery stage and moving towards the core stage. After this set of notes, there is a note check for you to take. Use this narration and the slideshow of notes that I've shared with you to help you complete that. Thank you for listening.